FM, I'll say it.
Thank you, everyone. Very, very impressive noise there. Welcome to Tyke-Lipped. You'll notice there's a weak pun. I'm not renowned for my weak puns, obviously, but that is one of them. We will be talking to someone who's very much engaged with Yorkshire dialect and the Yorkshire Dialect Society. That'll be Colin Speakman. Good evening, Colin.
Good evening.
And we will be hearing from three young poets. We hope you might have noticed, eagle-eyed amongst you might have noticed there's only two here. We have at the end there Sam Allison. Good evening, Sam.
Hello. Who's
come all the way from Scarborough and he's from Pickering and speaks with an East Yorkshire dialect when he's prompted. And from Halifax, the wonderful poet Zara Sihar.
Hello.
Hello. Unfortunately, we've got a couple of apologies for today. Zara's a very good friend and also a friend of our community's Armin Khan was supposed to be here. Grew up in the same street as Zara. Is a fantastic poet and we were looking forward to hearing from her today. Her grandfather is very unwell and she's had to call off, unfortunately. And also, Rod Dimbleby, our expert Yorkshire dialect person, is not particularly well at the moment. He's got shingles and it's affecting his eyes and he's not able to come today either. So that has left, and also James Wraith is supposed to be coming here, another young writer in Yorkshire dialect, and he has been held up, like a lot of people have today, with very poor public transport in the high winds that are going out, and he's coming from Sheffield. We hope he will be here before the end to share his work with us. But if he doesn't get here, us four are going to do the heavy lifting and talk about Yorkshire dialect because it's something very important. I would just like to say as well, someone else who had trouble getting here today is a public transport campaigner, and he's right next to me, and his name is Colin Speakman. Good evening, Colin.
Good evening.
You got here on the bus from Leeds?
Yeah, it's quite a journey, actually.
Quite a journey, yeah.
You arrive, and Leeds on a Friday night, everybody's there. And it's not only people, but taxis and buses. And the whole of Ball Lane was completely packed. And I had to wait about a quarter of an hour before, and you look at the screens and say, oh, it's coming in 5 minutes, then 5 minutes later, it's coming in 4 minutes, 5 minutes later, it's coming in 3 minutes, and you're just giving up, and the thing finally trundles round the corner. But what I think is relevant for tonight, just when you're waiting, killing time, the amazing variety of languages that you hear. Yes, certainly quite a bit of Yorkshire, but there were certainly South Asian languages. There were certainly quite a lot of Afro-Caribbean languages, quite a few I didn't recognise. And it just kind of made the point to me that we are very much in Yorkshire a multicultural, multilingual society. And dialect is still a living part of it.
Yeah, and Yorkshire dialect, which we often think of as being rooted in a past, is still very much a living language and is mixing with these languages in a melting pot and making new types of language for the future. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, language always changes. It's not static. It's not invented by academics in dictionaries. It belongs to the people. In fact, people used to talk about Yorkshire dialect, and I think it's a lovely word, as folk speech. In other words, it's a language of working people. And if you actually analyse a lot of, certainly 19th century Yorkshire dialect, it's full of words from agriculture or industry. Particularly things like the mining industry and the coal industry and the steel industry. And of course, as these industries have changed or disappeared, a lot of the words are now obsolete. But I dare say there are new words coming into the language which people use on building sites. And the best places to hear dialect isn't so much in the colleges and the universities. You want to go round to the pubs, you know, and the soccer matches where people gather and just listen. It's quite interesting because Leeds University did some work recently and they were collecting dialect. And they had a series of wonderful exhibitions, absolutely marvellous, all in museums. and they were asking people who came to the museums to give their favourite dialect words. Well, it cost £5 to go in these particular museums, and it would have been so much better if they'd just gone into one or two of the local pubs and listened.
Yeah, no, that's true. Do you find that certain parts of Yorkshire dialect has survived better? I think of somewhere like Barnsley, for example. If I'm there in that area, I hear a very distinct dialect, and it's definitely rooted and seems to have its roots kept, but also is progressing as a language at the same time.
Oh, indeed. If I wanted to say the epicentre of Yorkshire dialect in 2024, must be South Yorkshire and Barnsley in particular. Now, whether that's anything to do with a certain guy called Ian Macmillan, otherwise known as the Bard from Barnsley, I know not. But again, it's all to do with the mining industry. I remember as a quite young lad, I think in the 60s, going into a pub in Barnsley with a load of miners, and I could not understand a single word that was being said. It was brilliant. These days, I think my ear is much more tuned, you know. But it's true, it's still strong and it still survives, but of course it is changing.
Yeah. Well, Ian is a very familiar name and face around here. He wrote a book called Cheltenham Chanter, which was supposed to be really just a light-hearted look at Yorkshire dialect. Some people, some maybe purists, felt that it didn't quite hit the register as they wanted. But really, because language is always in flux, and his was a light-hearted book intended for a populist market, we're kind of maybe making a category error, do you think, and that we should just look at any dialect as something that is a living language?
Yeah. I sometimes describe dialect as being part of a spectrum. If you think of somebody with a nice Yorkshire accent who speaks standard English, very nice voice, very pleasant to listen to. But you'll find people with a strong Yorkshire accent, if you like, on the middle or further end of that spectrum, where the language gets, as we put it, broader and broader, till eventually you'll get forms of speech, and you'll still find in parts of East Riding, for example, when if you're not familiar with it, you have to listen very carefully. And there could come a point where you could almost describe it as a different language. Yeah. So it's not a question of, you know, black and white, but really a question of degree.
So it might be a good time then to bring in Sam, because Sam is from East Yorkshire and speaks standard English, but he also speaks and writes in East Yorkshire dialect. Is that right, Sam?
Hello.
Hello.
Sorry, excuse me.
Yeah.
Technically, I'm from North Riding.
Okay. Yeah.
But they're very, very similar, especially when you get to the border.
Yeah.
I think, what you're saying is it's entirely true, especially when you get to, like, the villages of the Moors. You hear, and you can still hear, if you listen carefully, you can hear, like you said, it's almost like a different language. You have to almost learn it. It's not something you can always just pick up, because some of the words are so different, and the accent is different, and the grammar is even different at times. Like my granddad, actually both my granddads. So I had one granddad from Hull, I believe. He wasn't very big on telling his life story, so. And I had another from Steppe, right. Although he always called it Steep.
Yeah.
And, well, you could sort of listen to them, and you could pick out these, well, what I now know from looking at sort of Middle English and Northumbrian Old English. So these are ancient forms of words. My whole granddad, he would say things like out and about. Not quite the same as my other granddad, where I'd say his diphthong was, well, more of a monophthong, like a ooh.
Yeah.
But he was more of an ooh. Although I can't quite capture the character exactly of his speech and do it justice.
It's reminiscent almost of like the northeast, and it maybe Middlesbrough. It's not.
They're related, aren't they?
Yeah.
And then when you cross, what's it called, the Humberloon line?
Yeah, that's right.
Then the traditional dialect turns from being derived from, is it Mercia, the Anglian kingdom, to being derived from Northumbria, which would have been
North.
Because,
Yeah.
north, about 1,000 years removed from now.
Yeah.
And it's also, I believe, Scots came from Northumbrian Old English as well.
Yeah.
So that's actually kind of interesting there. When you're arguing for a different language or different dialect, that muddies it a lot.
Yeah.
Because they're technically from completely different branches of the English Anglic language family tree thing.
Well, we is Peter Spafford here? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Now, we on the Delhi, we have a word each month, and I do a notes on the word. And that notes on the word usually takes us through Germanic languages and up into English, via Saxon and whatever. And quite often it cuts off at some point around about between Saxon and Norman, and around about there you think, hang on, that's quite Yorkshire. That's where it all comes from, isn't it? Yeah. What do you feel as a young person? Do you feel you're obviously engaged with it, but do you think that young people in general are engaged enough? Do they think enough about their language, their heritage?
I would say if you have to really think about a dialect or a language, then it's not in a good place. But I think it really depends on who you're asking, and obviously where. Like, obviously in big cities, like in the university centres, those kind of places aren't going to have particularly strong dialect because dialect is still viewed as wrong speech, which is very unfortunate because it's not. But if you go out into the rurals, you do occasionally get stuff like that, although I do believe that it has tended towards, over time, a more standard variety of English. I'm not quite sure how to articulate that in terms. I do think it's sad that there's this loss of interest, but at the same time, you're right that language does change. I just sort of wish that it continued the old roots rather than feeling like it was almost being replaced. That feels like that sometimes.
It's funny because I'm from London, which obviously is an even bigger city than your Hulls and your Newcastles or whatever, and there. You don't really hear people talking like me anymore. People younger than me don't speak like me. But then that's because the language is being diffused more. It's in more flux because there are so many people and there are so many outsiders who come in, like my parents, for example, came to England and then came to London. And that gives us a different type of language, and it's more readily going to happen in the big cities. That said, a lot of the poetry, when I look at dialect in poetry, I find the West Midlands and the Black Country very strong in that area. There's a lot of really strong poets where they think about dialect all the time in their poetry.
Yeah, it's still quite strong there, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. Zara, you and Amina, who is unfortunately not with us today, which is not very nice, but you were in a film with Colin. Colin was connected, and you were talking about your... People can still get it on YouTube, by the way. I can't remember what you have to put in. Probably their names would work. And you talked... I think it was a couple of years ago, wasn't it? And you talked about dialect and its importance to you. Growing up in a fairly large mill town, Halifax, in Yorkshire. How important has dialect been to you growing up, and now when you're writing, how much do you think about it?
I think it's such a multifaceted thing that you can't just think about it on its own. Growing up, I didn't give it too much thought when I was in primary school, to be fair, or even when I went to secondary school. It was only when I had to sort of venture outside the outskirts of my postcode where I had to sort of think about how I was speaking or enunciating. It didn't necessarily change the way I speak. I was just more conscious of how I was speaking, if that makes sense.
You hear yourself differently when other people don't talk like you.
It was when I went to sixth form, and it was a very middle class populated area, and I think being working class and also living in the north impacted the way I speak, or did then. I don't think much of it has changed anyway. and it was only in one specific class, funnily enough, it was English language, that I had to focus on enunciating or speaking a bit more slowly, which I don't know where I get speaking quickly from, whether it's speaking Patwari or Urdu, or whether it's just being working class and also just speaking as I do normally.
How do you other languages, like in your family? How does that have an impact on the way you speak English?
It did initially. Yeah. I was speaking about it earlier this week and how there were certain words growing up that I would say with a Patwari flair, so to say. Patwari is a dialect of Punjabi. And for example, my mum would say, instead of saying alarm, she would say alarum. Right. And growing up, I didn't realise, this is the quote-unquote incorrect way of saying it. And it was only up until I sat with my friends and we were just talking in conversation. They were like, oh, what did you say? And I had a moment of realisation. But then again, on the back foot of that, I think dialects aside, but also just looking at words and how the English language borrows words from other languages as well, especially as an Urdu speaker, seeing some of those words present in people's everyday speech was also interesting to note. And I know we've mentioned syntax and grammar here. Both languages have, Urdu and English have the opposite syntax, which was interesting thinking about growing up, more so subconsciously when I was younger.
Do you listen? Sometimes you come across an English word, a standard English word, or even a Yorkshire word, and think, that's Urdu, right? How often does that happen? Can you give us a couple, maybe?
I don't consciously think of it. Like, I know jungle derives from jungly, not a jungle. Pyjamas from pajama.
Bungalow.
Bungalow. I can't think of any else. But those two were like my favourite ones.
There's
Cha for tea,
char for tea.
Chai.
In the north of chai,
And Irish, which my dad spoke fluently, and my mum only spoke schoolgirl Irish, has quite a few usages in English. Smashing, for example, comes from ismashin, means that's great. And when American people say, do you dig it? That's from Tigenshay, which is, that's, are you interested in that? So, that's a thing from Irish.
Well, English is the magpie language. We steal words from all over the world.
We steal words from everywhere, exactly. So I wonder if one of you would like to read something for us. We don't have to do the full 10 minutes, but maybe... should we start with you, Sam? Would you got anything you'd like to read us?
Yeah.
You can go up to the mic and do so.
Yeah. I've written a few things in dialect.
Yeah.
Excuse me. How long of a piece?
Well, we're probably going to give you like 10 minutes, maybe more.
10 minutes.
But not straight away. You can maybe just do a short poem now, or a short piece of writing now, and then we can. And then Zara can do the same. We can talk about the things that brings up, and then we can come back again.
All right.
Is that we can go to the...
I wrote a riddle. Would that be all right?
You wrote a riddle?
I wrote a riddle.
I wasn't expecting a riddle. Go on.
No. Okay. All right. Oh, excuse me.
A Yorkshire riddle.
Hold on. All right. You have to go slow when reading dialect, so excuse me if I'm a little bit, sort of stagnant. As driven about, but not by a farmer, as a great big coat, but I ain't ever sheared, yet still I lose it on the road. I come with an herd of many different colours and shapes, and it flummoxes folks. They all lakes at us, and thinks for many different things, and many different beasts. Some others are great, and others are Lyle, but Lyle yans didn't ever feel bad for their sins, because it's great yans that make most fuss when they lose their coats. When it's time, I take me coat off, and it breaks apart into the thrang of tiny bits, and it can hap o'er a yell tone, and all folks within. What am I?
Wow. Wow. I don't think that Zara's going to do anything like that. But have you got something you'd like to read us about your voice and about maybe if you do that first, and then we can talk about them both down here. God, that was
Amazing.
it was amazing. Yeah.
I'll do the one that I did on Collins. I think.
Oh yeah.
It's titled Hospitality. Calloused hands, sandpaper for tongues, gaps in our speech filled by cups of tea. But when we speak, our teeth turn into piano keys. We sing melodies from gullies and paths paved by cobblestone and concrete. Mark our walks with moors, cricket fields and goalposts. We don't skip cues, but maybe drop some T's. We have our own dictionary. We're best known for his hospitality, more specifically hospitality. Cups, mugs and kettles full of it, for barns too. Call it a cuppa, a brew, chai, or Yorkshire's finest tea, because everyone knows that's what we do. We punctuate our sentences with love, pet and our kids. Greet you a dozen different ways, but always with a smile on our face. We don't water down our accent. Instead, we strengthen it with 2 to 3 cups of brew. Nurture the sounds of Halifax, Huddersfield, Bradford, Leeds, Rotherham, Barnsley, Ilkley, Sheffield, Whitby, York, Harrogate and Haworth. And you still wonder why our fields are so green. When we speak, our words water the earth. Vocabulary rich of minerals and plenty of tarloves, the alright pet, chuffing eggs to revitalise the ground. The flower we have is beauty in its own barbed wire. A metaphor of our speech is the white rose of Yorkshire. Thank you.
Wow. Beautiful. Thank you, Zara. I'll come to you, Sam, since you read first. I've got to say, Colin and I met because I answered the call in August 2023 for a course starting in September 2023 for 6 weeks, I think it was, which was run by Rod Dimbleby, who we were hoping would be here tonight at Keighley Library. And I think on week 3 or 4, Colin came along. And that's where we met, and we started talking about dialect, and we've engaged ever since. And what I learned on that course was, well, it was great, but also I kind of thought, this is good, I can kind of engage with Yorkshire dialect. I know these words. I mean, every time you give me a word. Now, I reckon I know probably every word, or nearly every word in your poem, but I didn't really follow it quite as I would if it was standard English. It was difficult for me it was like listening to something in French, which I can understand, but I have to really strain to. And it was a bit like that. So it definitely then sounded like a different language, not just a different dialect.
That's my granddad's dialect, I think.
Yeah.
My step-granddad.
Yeah. Amazing.
It's not just the words, it's the intonation too, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the music of the language, which you've captured beautifully.
Because I got each word, I think, like Jan is one, Moni is many, and, things like Thrang, there's a lot of people about.
Great stuff.
But it's brilliant, fantastic. But it's the whole thing, because of the intonation and all the rest of it, it's not easy to follow. It takes a while, doesn't it, to get the skills. Whereas yours was more familiar, because obviously it's in the standard English register, but it's definitely it's infused with West Riding dialect as well, in the chuffing X and all that. I love it when you said skipping cues but not dropping T's. Was that it? Was that what it says?
Yeah.
I think that's right. Yeah, fantastic. And when you write a poem like that, what are you just thinking about your identity and heritage, or is there a wider thing that you're looking at there, or do you not really know? You might not really know.
I think there's similarities between both cultures, but also languages, especially when it comes to tea, but then also looking at maybe like idiolects, idioms, glottal stops, all of that stuff. But yeah, I think just looking between like the similarities between the speech, but also how I speak and how people around me speak, growing up with more than one language on our tongues, and maybe the influence of that. And I think I don't try to capture it in a way where I'm focused on the words, but maybe more so imagery. So when I say, for example, when I mention tea, it's such a Yorkshire thing, but also it's such a South Asian thing.
Yeah.
And if you don't know what like a farban is, it's a saucepan, and you make tea in it, but you boil the milk instead. But we'll still use Yorkshire tea bags in that. So it's fusing both of those identities together, because essentially that's how I was brought up.
And you're doing the same with the language.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's like literally infusing it.
I think it's a source of great richness.
Yeah.
Because it's a dual heritage.
It is,
You know, and the two overlap and enrich each other. In the same way, Sam, yours does, doesn't it? You can speak excellent standard English, but you can also then delve into this wonderful treasure house of the most marvellous words. I mean, in recent years, I've been struggling to try and write in dialect, and it's quite a test for me because I'm not a native dialect. I'm one of these posh guys that had to learn it, you know. But dialect provides a huge, rich storehouse, doesn't it, of words and imagery that you can dip into. And in your case, you've got your South Asian language that you can dip into. Which is absolutely Punjabi and
I think we have to a quick disclosure here, because you probably wouldn't know, but Colin isn't even from Yorkshire. He's from Manchester, or near Manchester, isn't he?
Absolutely.
I don't know, maybe some of you don't realise this, but neither am I. Yeah.
Right, there's three ways of being Yorkshire. Yorkshire. You can be born here. You count for that, or you too, right?
Yeah.
You can live here. But the really important bit is where your heart is, where you feel you belong. That's what defines being Yorkshire. All right?
Yeah, but you can belong to more than one place.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
I mean, I belong to London and Ireland and
there you go.
what have you. And I mean, because we should maybe talk a little bit about our well-being, because it's linked. There is data about this. One of our guests earlier this week was the broken-backed poet, Rebecca Kenny. In fact, I was talking to her about this show. She wasn't able to be here. She wasn't due to be here anyway. But she's done a lot of work in her teaching profession on oracy and its impact on people's well-being, on their feelings of identity and all the rest of it. So it's quite important stuff we're talking about. And for me, for example, I don't know if you have this with any of the language. I don't know, are there languages in your family that people speak that you don't? Or is it just those ones you mentioned?
I think at a point I thought I had like receptive bilingualism. And in fact today, because I do work in a college, I've got some students that will speak in Urdu. I think the cut-off point for me was, it's not that I can't speak them, I can. It's a matter of fluency. When I was up until 14, I used to speak Patois every day at home. My mum always emphasised that we learn English at schools, but we need to be speaking Patois at home. And for my parents, it was all right. They could speak English. My dad more fluently than my mum. As a taxi driver, he also picked up certain phrases and words. And I'd say he's got a stronger Yorkshire accent than my mum has. So growing up, my grandma lived with us, and I'd always have to speak Patois with her because she didn't understand English. Maybe a few naughty words here and there, but other than that, she didn't really. She didn't know much. She knew how to say hello, no speak English, because that was the important bit to say. So I would speak with her all the time, and my parents would try and encourage us to speak Patois at home. Again, we'd learn English at school, and on the playgrounds, on the parks, whatever. It was only up until my grandma passed away when I was 14 that, sadly, her passing was also symbolic of a passing of my Patois in some sense, because we slowly started to emit some of the words from our everyday speech, began to speak more English at home, just because like we knew our parents could comprehend everything that we were saying. And my mum, my mum and dad don't speak Urdu. I mean, it's the national language of Pakistan, but it's associated with education and prestige.
Oh, right.
It's not spoken by the majority. And so that's like a status thing. So she wanted me to learn Urdu when I was little as well, and I just hated learning all the Urdu more specifically because it's very refined, it's very posh, it's very eloquent. So anyway, when my grandma passed, I stopped speaking Patwari at home as much, and with other people on the street as well. There wasn't much of a reason to speak it other than personal choice, if I wanted to, I guess.
It's interesting how that cuts, though, isn't it, against you? Urdu is, you say, like the language of the educated and you know, the posh, whatever, and it cuts against your English working class background, you know, in a mill town. It's an interesting dichotomy, isn't it?
So after that, like, I think loads of years passed and I just kept speaking English with my parents, and, you know, it just became normal. And I just code switch quite often. I think code switching sort of became a third language I adopted, and I looked more at that in when I was studying at university and in my poetry as well, more specifically. And through that, because we're not constantly speaking it, you know, there's a little language cognitive decline, and only in the last couple of years I've noticed, when I have worked in diverse areas and I am having to speak Patwari or Urdu to people, there's a lot more hesitations and pauses in my speech that you sort of adopt as, they take up space in the form of words, and I also see them as a language because there's something to be said about silence.
Someone should teach me that, I think. I mean, personally, as a child of immigrants, but who didn't come from as far, but they came with a language. My mum didn't really speak it, but my dad was a native Irish speaker, and he left when I was quite small, and he died nearly 30 years ago. And I don't know how you would feel that, but I feel a bit robbed of that heritage. I didn't get I would have liked him to have taught me to be speaking at home in Irish, even in London. It's a very difficult place to learn Irish, London. You want to be in Ireland learning it. And I guess you were cast adrift from your family's country, but they still kept the language going at home, and that's really important, isn't it? Even if you may have lost a bit from your grandma's time. But
do you still have friends where you can get together and speak Patwari? Or?
All of my friends speak Patwari, whether they've moved out.
I'm your friend, aren't I?
You know bits and bats, I'll teach you some. The majority of my friends that do speak Patwari will speak it in conversation, more specifically code switching, because there's no need. I think it depends on context as well, which is a huge signifier. Sometimes I think the translation, if I am having to translate phrases or a joke in Urdu or Patwari, English cannot do it justice, and vice versa. There's a specific one I say to my mum all the time. It very much depends on context. Some of my students speak Urdu, and I'll encourage them to speak English. So I'll explain the work sometimes in Urdu, and they'll respond in English. But also, it's a way for me. Like, I learned a new word today. It's gone out of my head today. But in Urdu, and I was like, oh, I didn't know a word existed for. I think it was like difficulty or something. But I think it's just trying to immerse myself in the language a lot more. And you know how, excuse me, you said, like, you're not in Ireland to be able to speak Irish, and it's hard to do it in London. When I was studying English language at A-level, there's something about, I think Colin will know as well, up until you hit the age of puberty, there's something about the cognitive ability of a child that can absorb language like a sponge, and after that point, it's very hard to decline. I don't know if you want.
True. Where you grew up as a teenager usually dominates your accent, and you never lose it, which is nice in a way. And I've also heard stories, certainly in Wales, maybe true of your communities too, when elderly people lose all their English and can only speak Welsh. That happened to my grandmother, although she never used her Welsh, but it was only when she was literally in the last few weeks of her life she almost could no longer speak English. She almost went back to her girlhood language. So I
That's
suppose it's
interesting.
there.
I didn't know that.
So, yeah.
Sam, do you have, when you have your pals, in Scarborough or whatever, do you have people like Zara does to speak the Yorkshire language with?
There is one person I live with who is actually everyone kind of understands some dialects. There's one guy who's noticeably broader. I say often you can tell when someone's speaking a northeastern Yorkshire dialect because of that R at the end of words.
That's right.
You can hear me saying it. That's very local. And so I thought of even before I came here, I read some of my stuff and he understood it. But I don't have many people otherwise, unfortunately.
Yeah.
There isn't really a place you could go to look for people who speak dialect.
No, but it's an issue though, isn't it? Because if you were cut off from friends who spoke those languages with you, you would feel that, wouldn't you? You'd feel like that's something you've lost.
There is an East Riding Dialect Society. It meets in Driffield, but they're generally elderly farmers and farmers' wives, average age about 75. But it's very lively group. So it's still, still there.
And that sort of touched on another problem. Obviously, we've invited young people here today, and because that's important to root the language in people who are coming up and are going to keep it going and pass it down, because the Yorkshire Dialect Society is the oldest dialect society in the world, is it?
That's correct, yeah.
But most people involved with it are getting on a bit.
We're working on it.
We're working on it. Yeah, I know. You were talking to me about it, and I'm not young like these people are, and that's a problem, I think, is it? Do you think that creates if we don't get the continuity?
I suspect it's there, but it needs a bit of support and encouragement. Schools could help. I think it was your friend Amina made the point that when she was in school, she was often corrected by a teacher if she used Yorkshire words. I don't know if it happened to you, When I was a teacher of English, and I made a great point of encouraging kids to say us books or whatever, But the really important thing is to become bilingual, isn't it? To teach all kids, yes, to speak and understand fluently standard English, but also not to discourage the language they grew up with, and to actually encourage them to use dialect words, local words, words from their background.
That's
very rich.
That's a very sustainable position for a language to be in as well. It doesn't sound it, but it really is. There are tons of languages across the world that are kind of like home languages, like they're spoken among families and among communities, but there's some other, like a lingua franca, which takes over in formal contexts. Like there's tons of those, and a lot of them are doing quite well. There's nothing saying that we shouldn't be able to speak dialect and English. We can speak both. We could speak dialect among people who understand dialect, and English among people who understand only English. I say English, and it's different, but
codes. You mentioned the word Bernstein's codes, and what Basil Bernstein said. This is way back in the 1960s. That most of us grow up with kind of two kinds of languages. Our family language, our friends' language, the one our parents use and our peer group, particular kids we grow up with, and posh. And you've got to learn and master, and that's why oracy is so important, to give all people confidence in using English as fluently as possible and reading the great literature and being able to converse and listen and be competent. But not at a price of losing their old language, their childhood language. And in fact, a lot of people are bilingual insofar as they can switch. You can go into a room and immediately pick up the vibes and suddenly start using your dialect words, And it happens in varying degrees. And I think that should be almost built into the teaching of English and the teaching of oracy. And in particular, not to make kids ashamed of their language that they grew up with, or indeed their accents. Because, you two guys, you've got beautiful accents, very soft, gentle accents. That is very important that you never lose them.
But even hard, gritty accents are still all right as well. If that's what they are. Obviously, being from London, but anyone from anywhere, Black Country, from Yorkshire, we've always had the people trying to beat it out of us, you know, like, don't talk like that. That's, you know, you're dropping your H's, or you've got your glottal stop, or what have you. In some places, we've mentioned Wales and I've mentioned Ireland, those countries, governments and landowners tried to beat these languages out of people, to the sense that the Welsh and Irish languages declined a lot. And interestingly, Irish is growing, and it's growing mainly because of Asian and African immigrants who are coming in, and their kids are saying, well, we'd like to, they're taught it at school, but they think, well, this is the language of our country, we should know it. Whereas a lot of Irish kids, you know, like my nephews, and they, when they were at school, they were just thinking, it's just a bit of Irish, and they speak a bit, they're not really bothered. But the immigrant communities coming in see it as very important, and they've driven up.
The real success story, of course, is Wales, you know.
Yeah, well, massive,
But also in Cornwall, Cornish is on the rise.
Yeah,
you know?
It was dead, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was actually gone. The last person living speaking it died.
About 4,000 or so people now speak reasonably fluent Cornish. And road signs and names on buses are in Cornish. It's quite amazing where that's happened.
Before we have some more performances, we should just maybe talk about Wales, because Wales has something, a cultural festival, which is very interesting and very famous, and it's called an Eisteddfod. And we are hoping, or you are hoping, because you've been the driving force behind it, to get something like an Eisteddfod going next August. The Thriddings Fest next year.
Starting Yorkshire Day.
Starting on Yorkshire Day, 1st of August, isn't it? Yeah.
And we've already talked to Bradford Council, and they're very keen, because Bradford City of Culture next year is hosting Yorkshire Day. And I've talked to the key councillors, in particular Councillor Alex Ross-Shaw, and he's very keen on the idea that we use the weekend after Yorkshire Day and possibly extend it on the Monday to have a great celebration of Yorkshireness. Music, spoken word, poetry,
and
dance.
Will you invite an outside broadcast from Chapel FM?
Absolutely. I'm assuming we can be partners, particularly on the spoken word.
I hope so.
Brilliant.
I really hope so. We'd really love to be involved. So I think I'd like to another little round of performances, and I think because James isn't here, Colin, I wonder if you would like to give us a poem. Would you like to stand at the front? Or you can sit here if you like, but if you prefer to stand at the thing, you can do that.
I can read it here, couldn't I?
If you like, well, it's up to you. It's whatever you think.
I should explain that I think I said earlier that I'm somebody who's always grew up on the border between Lancashire and Yorkshire and spoke as a kid a mixture of Yorkshire and Lancashire accent and quite a few dialect words, and studied English at Leeds University, where dialect and linguistics was part of the course. So I got to know it. But as a writer, I find I'm increasingly fascinated by that rich language which is out there, which is, if you're a poet or a writer, is a wonderful thing to be harvested. So here's a bit of fun. It's a kind of intended to be a kind of winter poem. It's written for our Christmas crack, which we're going to have in the Yorkshire Dialect Society in a week's time. And it goes right back to a story which is in, I think, one of the most marvellous books about England's history. The Venerable Bede's Ecclesiastical History of England. Now, it's probably everybody's bedtime reading. But there's a wonderful bit in that which is very memorable. When King Edwin was deciding whether or not to adopt what was coming from the Pope, the emissary, St. Gregory and St. Augustine, whether or not Northumbria should be converted to Christianity, and Paulinus was the emissary of the Pope, they actually had a meeting in somewhere in Northumbria, in a typical the king's great banqueting hall. And during the banquet, a sparrow through one door of the hall whizzed across the room and whizzed out the other side. And one of the wise men, one of the thanes that was part of this debate, he said, human beings, that's like our life. There's a lot of blackness, a few moments of absolute splendour and wonderful, our life, and then it all disappears into blackness, and we don't know what's happening. And then he said, well, if Christianity, this new religion, is going to offer us something, maybe it's worth thinking about. So I'm imagining 1,000 or so years later, or more, a Dales farmer telling that story. is called Bede's Spuggy. The Spuggy is a sparrow. Now here's an old tale I've heard tell. Long time sin, Edwin was as Yorkshire king, sitting with his thanes by fire in his hall so grand, blethering on about so many things. All gradely folk were fratching about which god were daft and which were reet. Them old pagans or this new fellow wit cross, the yammering went on for half neat. Then up rose a porky fella sitting at the back. Now then, lads, he says, did you not just see yon lad Spuggy as just flicked out at door? Pin back the lugs and hark to me. Yon Spuggy is like all on us, lad and a lass. We come on a sudden out at dark at neat, that nither in winter wet, to spend not a few moments in warmth and leet. Then alles is o'er, and we're back in dark, lost forever, like the little wild Spuggy forgot. But sithee, I'm yon fella fra Rome, Spak Reed. He says when we dee, we shan't in cold grave rot, but rise with golden wings to what he calls heaven, where them angels sing, and us beer and bannock is free, and sun allus shines. I'll join them folk and sign up tomorrow, says Edwin the king. That's back and true. Then temples at pagan gods I'll burn down, follow good book and Jesus' cross, and a grand kirk I'll build in old York town.
Let's have a quick squint at it. I couldn't do this with Sam's because this is on his blower and I couldn't.
Bit of Christmas fun.
But I mean, things like this, for example, gradely, it just means good. It means like fantastic. I knew that from Mary Edgar and all those musical things I used to like when I was a kid. And fratching bout is like, you know, getting all restless and
and lovely strong friend. Fratching.
Yeah. Pin back the lugs. Pin back the lugs and arc at me. That's means listen up.
You still occasionally hear pin back the lugs, innit?
Oh, you will, yeah. You will. Yeah. So that's brilliant. Well, thank you for that. We're going to have a couple of younger people, if you don't mind, who are also going to go up and read again. Sam, would you like to read something else for us?
Yeah, sure. What if should I read the thing I submitted for the winter bulletin?
Yeah, summer bulletin.
No, but it's for the winter.
Oh,
for the Yorkshire Dialect Society?
Yeah, for the Yorkshire Dialect
transactions?
I wrote the story about the fox.
Oh, yeah.
All right, well, I'm sure we'd like to hear a story about a fox.
Just kind of like a sort of light-hearted little story, sort of like a style like of the old dialect literature that was written in like the 1800s. Yeah. Not as broad, though.
Yeah.
That wouldn't be very easy to understand.
No. So we don't have to understand it, we just have to get the rhythms.
That's true, that is true.
That's fine. About not understanding.
All right. Farmer Dent and his family were winding down for sleep. Sun was setting over Wheeldale Moor, its last lights glistening in bracken, like fireflies laking and dancing. All were coming on well for 'em. Their chickens had settled in and were macking eggs at a granary yet. But as Farmer Dent and his house had their fill, there were Jan at Laketon wi' envy. He traipsed for guilty dale, his poor hard belly whacking wi' hunger, sick as he could hardly breathe. He were a fox, and he'd set his een on Farmer Dent's chickens. Now that fox, he were a canny lyle fox. He plodded through plodders, through cars, through bracken, and through rainstorms. But he knew he couldn't fight a man like Farmer Dent and keep his life. But he was so hungry, it vexed him after dead. He thought so long on his next meal, he couldn't think of naught else. He charged, each feet drumming on ground, while he came to the Lyle Garth, Farmer Dent's garth. And Farmer Dent was standing at window, rife for his coming. Thou, Farmer Beeld, thou, there, I see thee. The fox leaked out at Garth, that old farmer. He might have been coming on 60, but he were as stark nor ever. His een seemed almost as them of a wolf, glowing at dark. I's fettled this place up with money traps since thou came last. thou wilt be able to come of here. If thou tries it, as I'll keep thee, and I'll kill thee, and thou'll never be able to taste me bonny chickens. Thou mun nobbut turn round and leave, and find thee tear somewhere else. And with that, he shut window. But fox weren't fled, not yet a bit. Wishly, he put his paw yon yacht, traipsing into farmer's garth. He kenned our let at what farmer said about money traps. Well, he meant that. And nobbut first step, he met with a great leet to frighten him away. But at dark, he couldn't see nowt, despite being a fox, and it nobbut made him feel reet at yam. He thanked Farmer Dent for his cosy leeting. Second step, he met with a great fire to burn him. But he were card, and it nobbut made him warm up. He thanked Farmer Dent for his lovely inglenook. Third step, Farmer Dent had coat on. He stuck his ear out at window. Why weren't thou dee? He yelled. And he started banning and swearing at Fox, sick as his wife had to cover their bairns' lugs. A third trap sprang. A great big hammer to bray yon Fox into grund. But it nobbut went and missed him, dinging poor old farmer with his face. Fox thanked Farmer Dent for his built-in swear words filter. Well, that Fox did get to chickens at end. He ate up yarn after t'other, but his mensfulness take over. So he left a bonny lot on him alive for Farmer Dent and his family. He was here capped by Farmer's accidental hospitality, and he felt forced to leave him a good review online. Fox were never seen again, and Farmer Dent's bairn learned a few new words.
Very good. Very good. Fantastic. Ian, by the way, is eyes, in case anyone was wondering what that was. But there's lots of words in there to get you
some of the
get you
words,
going.
lovely old English words.
Beautiful, yeah.
And Beowulf and, Middle English. Yeah, that's a good example. Super. And I love the little touch bringing the modern bit in at the end. Oh,
yeah. That was,
Nice.
Before we bring Zara up to do another little bit, I just what you said at the start about people understanding it, and I said it doesn't really matter as long as I get the rhythms of it. At Bradford Libraries, the Bradford Central Library, a few weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago, I went for an event run by Nabila Ahmed. She's a really good friend of our poetic community, and she does a lot of great work in Bradford. And she brings together really disparate types of poets into that space there. And one of them, this particular time, was a friend of mine called Kieran Lee Higgins, who's a really good punk poet. You know, he's about in his mid-40s, but he wears Fred Perry, and he's really thin and does all this really punk stuff, pork pie hat, that kind of stuff. And it's very gritty and it's very realist, and it's got some language in it that some people, it frightens the horses sometimes. And sitting next to me was an older man who was Pakistani, and he read his poem. He had 3 languages that he used, none of them English. And he had a book with him, which was his book. And he was a very kind of formal, very sort of conservative sort of looking person, with a very neat moustache. He's probably about 70. Turned out he was a retired teacher, which he exactly looked like. And he got up and did his poems, and some of them were sung, as is tradition in some parts of... And it was very, very different from what Kieran Lee Higgins was doing. He's from Halifax as well, by the way, and he speaks with, Halifax dialect. But the mutual respect between them and the admiration for each other's craft, and the rest of us, we didn't understand what this guy was. Some people there were from South Asia and did, but we didn't. But we understood the flow so that's sometimes what language can do. We don't always have to understand all the words, because there's that musicality we get. Zara, we have something else. By the way, I'm not going to insist that you read Dad's Taxi, because every time I say, can you please read your award-winning poem, Dad's Taxi, she goes, no, I've rinsed that one. But I always try and get her to do it again, because I'm quite interested now, because I didn't know that your dad spoke with a kind of Yorkshire accent as well. I didn't know that. And that kind of enriches that story for me, that he does. So maybe before the end of this, which will be in about 20 minutes or so, maybe you would like to, but you can read something else now if you like, anything you want.
I was just going to say I've rinsed it. I retired that poem, but
don't retire.
I might give it to you.
It's such a great poem, and also it talks about identity, and it talks about language, and it talks about all those things. So that's. But you can read anything you would like now. Good.
I think based on what you said, and also our conversation on the way up, just made me think about how sometimes you don't have to explicitly talk about dialect when you can hear it. And that's the reasoning behind the poem I'm going to read now, which it's been sat in my notes I've collected dust for a few years. It's called English is Not My First Language. I'm sorry, I'm a bit ill, so my voice is going. Excuse me. You took Urdu from me, stripped her independence, and skipped the August that exists between the 13th and 15th. You tried to alleviate my tongue of the weight of 36 and more letters, yet it still feels heavy. I bear the extra weight at Pakistan International Airport security of a tongue that's stationary. But tongue twisters in primary school roll effortlessly, sorry, clearly not. She sells seashells at the seashore, but when I try to utter some Urdu and Punjabi, it's punctuated with stutters and frequent apologies. My tongue struggles to move. She stays wavering between hellos and salams, and my greeting has now become a hesitation. You hear bits of Urdu in the mere pauses and breaths I take, and my punctuation doesn't know which language to claim. I think of the letters, the lafaz for this occasion, and that begins to occupy most of the left hemisphere of my brain, and the breaths I take consist of more Urdu than my tongue can stake a claim in my name. You took Urdu from me, peeled her skin while she was still ripening, and laid my tongue with the bitterness that's frequently diluted by the English I speak. So sometimes I'm pitied by the Angrezi reflection of me, and I recognize the brown on the outside of me, but fail to let all 36 letters coat my tongue. So silence is another language I acquired. Found an uneasy comfort my Zaban became accustomed to, but her poses were heavy, took a toll on my tongue, and tried to execute the Urdu my mother tried to pass on to me. And now I don't recognize the letters between my mother and her tongue. But there's a silence that Urdu carries. She is spoken in accordance with my heart's beat. I inhale her more than I do oxygen. और कुछ बार उर्दू के लफ्ज़ एक सराहना है, जिसका मेरी हवा इसके ऊपर होते हैं. English might occupy the northern region of my mouth, but उर्दू के पास मेरा दिल है. हर लफ्ज़ मेरी जान है, और इनके पास एक रोशनी है. लफ्ज़ मेरे चमक रहे हैं, सितारा और चांद के जैसे. ये ज़बान आसमान है, जो इस दुनिया नहीं चल सकता इस बगैर.
Wow. That was amazing. Thank you very much, Zara. Do you... I've obviously heard you read a lot of poems, but I haven't heard many where you've put other languages in. Is it something you're increasingly starting to do, or is it something you used to do and don't do so much? Or
it was something that I used to do, more so during university, and exploring hybridity in authenticity, and how code switching is this third language, and how specifically code switching is and can be authentic when it's not viewed as that. So throughout university, and once I realised I could write in Urdu and Patwari as well.
Wow.
More specifically Urdu, because I associated that, and it is associated with education and prestige, so there was some internal conflict there with the working class, Yorkshireness, and also generally just being working class. So I would, and that bit is in Urdu. There's no Patwari in that poem. That's something I'm still exploring. But early on during university, I would look at both the languages. And I think in the last couple of years, maybe it's just where the words fall naturally, where there isn't an English alternative,
Right.
just because that is the way I speak. When I'm surrounded by the people that also speak those languages, or if I need to use it, a good example to use of that is Arabic words that are universal to Muslims, because you'll hear people, give salam, say assalamu alaikum, or whether it's alhamdulillah, which is, thanking God, or bismillah before we eat. They're more universal. I think they fall off quite quickly and easily because it's something that's habitual and done since I was a kid, whereas Urdu and Batwari, more cultural words, there's a difference, and it is very context driven and surroundings dependent. But yeah, I think to answer your question, it was something I did a while ago.
Well, it's beautiful. The result is fantastic.
You talk about your working class background, but you're in very, very good companionship. Our greatest living poet is a Yorkshireman called Tony Harrison, who has a very humble working class root in Honslet in South Leeds. Got a scholarship to Leeds Grammar School, then went to Cambridge and became professor of Greek and whatever. Wonderful poet, and a lot of his he translates Greek tragedies as well, in brilliant Byron-like, rhyming pentameters. But his most powerful work, he brings in loads of words from his working class background, and swear words that in his famous poem V shocked Mary Whitehouse, and there was a debate in Parliament because the word F, was used for the first time in the poem. Incredible, powerful poem, but he uses his working class roots in his speech, and some dialect words find their way into that he's probably our greatest living poet. Now in his late 80s, still around.
Yeah, in fact, we Helen and I met him around his 80th. He was doing some stuff. And he was into the musical stuff, the Marriott Edgar stuff I was talking about, which surprised me. That's what I had a chat with him about. Also, Tony Harrison's Prometheus was filmed here a couple of years ago. And that was... It was screened here. I beg your pardon. See, there we are. There we are. I'm chairing a discussion on language and communication, and I can't even use the right word. It was not filmed here because it had already been filmed. It was screened here. Thank you. Anyway, we're going to go back to this. We've got, I reckon, a couple more performances before we finish, and then what we'll do is we'll have a quick wrap up and talk about the future of the immediate future, because next year is Bradford City of Culture, and we've got the Thriddings Fest, we hope, and then but also the broader future, the broader sweep of future history. So, do you two feel that you might like to give us one more piece each? You don't have to do Dad's Taxi. I'm not going to sulk or anything like that. I might. So Sam, do you want to take us away with one final piece?
I don't have any other pieces.
You don't have any other? Oh, God, bloody hell. That's, well, I'll tell you what then. If you don't have any pieces, then maybe instead...
Complete pieces.
They don't have to be complete.
Oh, but they're not good until they're complete.
Well, I disagree. I think they can be... Anyway, it's up to you. But perhaps there's someone got their hand up and they might be going to ask you a question. Perhaps you can deal with that instead.
Okay.
Is that right?
Thank you, Keith. I attempted to write a dialect poem this week because of a conversation I had in a tea aisle about how Yorkshire tea doesn't make green tea. And I was like, I can assure you, Yorkshire is very, very green. I could read that if you wanted.
Well, I mean, it feels like a guerrilla gig if you did, but you can.
It's funny how we speak certain dialects in Leeds.
Would you like to read it out the front?
Yeah, got it.
Then give me the microphone back, So, one thing I've noticed is people say "de" instead of "the."
So Yorkshire tea isn't green. Did they not make it? Did they not close mucky pits? Did they not make it pleasant and green? Do we not have stately homes? Do we not have a Yorkshire fair and full of dreams? So how can you say, in a particular way, that our Yorkshire tea isn't a godly green? Do you think they're gritty and mean? Do you think we only have gloomy scenes? Do you see the shining brews? Do you see the simple scenic view? Here, with me Yorkshire tea, I can assure you, we're green.
Very good. Thank you, James Lewis Moran. Excellent. I wasn't expecting that, and that's what live radio is all about. Yeah, the Yorkshire tea, because the is hardly a thing. You get your t. And there's a band called The. How do you say that if you're from Yorkshire? I'm going to get tickets for... Have you got it? Yeah, go on.
I've got a question for Sam, if you
Yeah, shall I give you this microphone? You can ask.
Well, was it sheep? The answer to your riddle.
It is close-ish, conceptually.
Okay. I'm interested in the answer to your riddle.
I'm honestly, I forgot about it, so the fact that you've still been... The fact that you've still been thinking about it, it kind of makes me happy. But yeah, the answer is clouds. Because, hang on, if I get the riddle back, I could show you the different lines, which say, oh, excuse me,
Clouds
telling me things.
about legs, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what made me start thinking about it. Because I was going to do sheep, because I thought, oh, Yorkshire, sheep, you know, very creative. But, okay, so I was driven about, but not by a farmer. So that is wind. The clouds are driven about, but not by anything that we can see.
Yeah.
As a great big quote, but I an't assured that yet still I'll lose it on the road. That's obvious, though, isn't it? Is that a cloud has a big coat, which it loses. It comes either heard of many different colours and shapes, and it flummoxes folks because people look at the clouds and they see different things. They see creatures like and objects that they aren't because. Is it pareidolia, that effect, where we see things, we see patterns in things, you know? Obviously someone has a great and others are Lyle, but Lyle Yans didn't ever feel bad for their sins because it's great Yans that make most fuss when they lose their coats. There's a huge difference between like those little streaky clouds and a cumulonimbus when it finally rains. And of course, it can pour a yell tune we all folks we in when it's finally ready to take off its coat because it rains or it thunders or snows or, whatever's going to come out of that cloud. Sometimes things other than those can come out of them. Well, not come out of the clouds, but rain down anywhere. Never mind, I'm rambling. That's the answer.
There we are. I think that deserves a round of applause. In fact, thank you. Yes.
What's fascinating, that's a literary form going right back to Anglo-Saxon poetry.
That's what I was inspired by. The Exeter
There you
book.
are. Well, and what a great thing to do, to revive a great tradition, which is still...
I just like-
and
like-
you still find it in dialect, don't you?
It's because I'm like, what gets written in dialect? You often get like almost like memoirs, almost sort of short, funny stories, like the Fox thing I wrote. And I'm like, no, I want to do something different. We're talking about like bringing a language, like bringing it up on its feet again.
Yeah.
Let's do something that people do with languages that isn't just those. And I thought, I don't know what exactly led me to riddle, but it kind of like a bunch of things sort of tumbled around in my head for a while, and I was like, yeah, let's write a riddle. That's a good idea, and it did turn out quite well, I think. I like it.
Excellent. It didn't cloud your judgment, did it?
We've got to have...
See,
We've got to have a
that's
competition.
very funny there.
Shocking. It's shocking, honestly. My daughter was here. She just, I'll be out.
We've got to have a dialect competition with a Thrillings Fest.
We got to be. I'm sure we will. And just before we go over to Zara for her final piece, your engagement with dialect, even though you're a young person, is rooted in traditions and all the rest of it. Do you see a bridge from that to the future? We'll be talking more about the future after Zara's go, but the future of the dialect, where people will talk in their own Yorkshire dialect everywhere, on every workplace, every estate, every field, every farm, every workshop, etc.
I would love that to happen.
Yeah.
Although I do have to say that like a lot of the words that I use and some of the pronunciations I didn't have as a kid. I learnt them from like listening really closely, and it was actually after, you know what you said about like when the brain stops being able to take in language as well. It was after that, and like I was able to learn a lot of these things. Even in like when I was 18 years old or older, I was still learning some words, and then I sort of had this like, really, oh, I'm going to put everything together that I know about the dialects. I'm going to learn everything that I can.
Brilliant.
It's like you don't have to have been born with it to have it.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I was born with an accent, and I said about the R at the end of words that I've always had that. But you don't need that even. If you want to put a lot of time in, you can do that with anything. And honestly, if I imagine a future with dialect as like a common language of Yorkshire is going to introduce. It's going to be, I mean, obviously, the dialect of 1910 existed in a very different world to the one we have. It's going to have so much more coming in and going out. It's going to be really, I'm excited even thinking about it, to think that what it could create and like how different influences might shape its path, and it might even split into several again. I don't know. And that's quite exciting. And if that happens, I would love to find out.
It's all about identity, isn't it? Who we are. And it's a question of going into the past, but also going into the future, as you rightly say, and giving the next generation a feeling of power, connecting with those many generations of the past. And it's happened in other parts of the world, of course, isn't it? Wales is a great example. Corsica is another one where Corsican language has been recreated. Let's do it in Yorkshire. Come on.
I mean, there are people. So a friend of mine, and Kieran Lee Higgins, I mentioned her in the last show that we did this evening on addiction, is called Toria Garbutt, and she is one of the best poets in the country, and she is in her early 40s, so relatively young, she's not, you know, and she is, her poems are in Yorkshire dialect, but they're not the Yorkshire dialect that would necessarily be familiar to people at the Yorkshire Dialect Society, because it comes from a very gritty place. Comes from a sort of heroin-riddled one-horse town that used to be a vibrant mining community and has now been completely devastated. And Yorkshire is unfortunately full of places like that, and different dialects are coming out of them. So where the mines were, now there's a very different kind of street speak, which is draws on the past, but is very much, it's very much going forward to the future. So that's interesting, and I think that we should have more Yorkshire poets in dialect.
Yeah, that was in Scots. Like a big part of what gave Scots its sort of like a big boost that allowed it to survive to the modern age was Robert Burns. He was like the reason almost.
We never quite had a Burns. We had some. John Hartley, for example, John Hartley's work. Terrific writer, but he's never quite. He was Division 2 rather than Division 1.
I mean, I've heard the name. I don't remember exactly where the name's go.
Zara,
more.
before we sort of wrap all this up with a sort of final look at the future of the Yorkshire dialect, would you like to read one more? And it can be anything you want. It doesn't have to be what I asked for.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Go on then.
Okay. Here we go. Here we go.
For Keith.
Oh.
I was sat in the back seat of my dad's car, or Yusuf's taxi, as his customers call it, stared out the window, thinking of how strangers fill my father's car with more stories and laughter in one day than I have shared words with him all week. His tasbih hangs off the rear view mirror, which he does not have to hold to do zikr. The sat-nav on his dashboard, an ornament. He drives past the pub that used to be a park he played in, and he smiles. He sees two versions of this town, one stored in his memory and the other muted on Google Maps. His customer stories leave a print on his memory foam seats, and his mind absorbs them too. He recalls them from the potholes and the traffic lights always green for him, turn red to hear him speak again. I ask my dad how he knows of all the shortcuts in roads in towns I've never seen. He laughs and says, "Putter, you have a degree in English and I have a degree in driving." We pass the corner shop, the playground, the kid screams, and I hear, "I bet your dad's a taxi driver. Taxi driver, taxi driver." They run laps around the playground, closing in on me. I think I've had they'd rather sneer a taxi driver than a profanity. As my words begin to formulate, they vanish like his diesel emissions. I say, "Yeah, my dad drives. He does do taxi. That doesn't mean I get free lifts, but all he does is lift me. It means I hid his job and livelihood in a cab-sized shadow of shame. I made him wait outside of parents' evenings and took my sister instead. Would have rather swallowed shame and guilt than to walk with him because his slight limp and worn-out shoes said more words in English than he could spew. And I didn't want his English to respond to how well I was doing in English. But I would still chew and swallow the dal his money put on a plate for us. Could handle the curry but not extend a courtesy towards my father, whose back hurts often, feet are swollen, whose knees bend in salah but hurt in a seat, whose hands grasp the wheel, white knuckles but palms still brown when they are cupped for pounds I'll create pakore. His hopeful heart waits for his kids to get a degree, so he can have a box full of baggage in his boot the next time a customer asks, "What is it your children do?" And his smiles are a sacrifice, his hands proud on the wheel that his fingers have molded to. He's not ashamed. He never has been. I carry the guilt he's never felt, and I am ashamed of ever carrying shame. So when I get this degree, I owe it all to you and the taxi drivers I had conversations with on the way to school. But I am proud now, Abuji. I know of the times you were called instead of an ambulance, how you faced black eyes by bastards because you had kids to come home to. I am sorry that I wrote poetry about rickshaw, using adjectives to boast about their colours, yet I have failed to write about a taxi. But I am proud now, Dad. I'm proud to be a taxi driver's daughter. And I tell every Uber driver that my dad does taxis too. And they feel at ease because I don't care whether their kids have degrees. I just like knowing my dad does taxis, and that is enough conversation for me. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Always has me just on the edge of, yeah. I'm fine. Thank you to, well, first of all, can we have a round of applause for both of our young readers? We'll also have a round of applause for our slightly less young reader. And I think I would like to finish this off with, our immediate future is that we have a year to look forward to where Bradford is the city of culture. An awful lot of things will happen. But in the middle of that, or just after the middle actually, in August, we hope there'll be this. Is it a done deal yet? The it's done.
Well,
so
we've got to make it happen. We've
got to make it happen. So we will all be supporting that. So that's a very good opportunity, isn't it, to stick a flag in the sand and say this is Yorkshire, and this year was the Yorkshire Declaration.
Oh, absolutely. I have a copy with me if anybody's not seen it. What happened was on April Fool's Day, right, was 50th anniversary of the abolition of the three counties, right, West Riding, East Riding and North Riding, that made up the province of Yorkshire, the Anglo-Viking kingdom. So 100 people signed this declaration.
And you heard it here last.
We read it out at the Eye of York, because York was never in the ridings, it's between them all, but where they would have met is just behind York Castle. There's a little oak tree. And we stood at the oak tree and we recited at noon on the 1st of April, just to celebrate April Fool's Day, when they got rid of the Great West Riding and the Great East Riding and put part of Yorkshire into Lancashire and whatever. So it's celebrating Yorkshire. I mean, after all, there's many people who live in Yorkshire who live in Norway, in Finland and Scotland. 5.5 million people, and we've got our language.
That's more than Ireland.
So important.
That's more than Wales as well.
Our two friends here have said it's absolutely right we keep that language alive and the great pride that we have with it.
And what's the longer term future? We have a couple of young people here. There were a couple of young people who unfortunately couldn't make it. And when we talk about Yorkshire dialect, we need to be talking about these young people, don't we? And that's the challenge, is to get them all going at the same...
Well, we're going to learn from Wales, and the key thing about the Eisteddfod in Wales, it's all about young people. And I happened to see the film of the last year's Eisteddfod, and there were 2,000 kids in one arena to a pop concert in Welsh, all singing in Welsh. Now, that's what we need to do in Yorkshire, 2,000 youngsters singing, whether it's Ilkley Moor Hat or whatever.
Yeah. I think we'll get into trouble if we do Ilkley Moor Hat. I think we'll probably have to leave that. But it's interesting about the Welsh, the pop songs and all that. There was a film made this year, which I still haven't seen yet. I've got to find time to see it, called Kneecap. And it's an Irish film where a gang of lads, I think it's lads, or is it lads and lasses? I don't know. But anyway, I haven't seen it yet. But they're rapping in Irish. Rapping in Irish, if you please. And is that something, Sam, that you think you might get in rapping in Yorkshire dialect? Because I think that the results could be comical, but also very interesting.
I'm not clever enough to write rap.
You might not be, but there are other people.
Yeah, I've thought about that sometimes. Because, all right, have you ever read... Oh, what's it called? It's the book that has the like waked edge. It's this really big sort of traditional poems and songs, and the tunes are lost. But I've read through it, and by God, they're good. They are amazing poems. I would love to set some of those to music.
Wow.
There's tear jerkers. There's happy stuff. It's
are you a musician as well, or are you a musician yourself as well?
I can write music, but I don't write. I don't write folk.
Okay, but is Peter still there? Peter Spafford? Has he gone? Is he not there? But this is the sort of thing that we might bring to Chapel FM. You know, these things you're talking about. Another thing we were thinking of bringing to Chapel FM, but instead it's going to debut at Thriddings are these Mormon plays that you told me all about. Now, Fred Mormon was he's professor of English at Leeds University until 1919, when he died in an accident in the River Wharfe. And he wrote plays in Yorkshire dialect. There were a few of them.
Three.
Three of them.
They were last broadcast in the 1930s, and they've been forgotten ever since. So it wouldn't have been lovely.
Yeah.
And Mormons was a brilliant collector of dialect and dialect music and songs and whatever, and one of the greatest. And he was a huge force in the Yorkshire Dialect Society, but he also set up the School of English at Leeds University. He was a huge influence. One of his pupils was Herbert Reed. Yeah. And the guy that followed him after he died tragically, you may have heard of, he was called John J.T. Tolkien. So Tolkien was hugely influenced, no doubt, by Mormon. And these plays have been forgotten. Yeah. And we hope to revive them with some young people reading them.
We do. In fact, this was going to be a recital of them. It was only that at Thriddings Fest we thought maybe that would be the time to debut them. So that's interesting. And also, in fact, if you look on the East Leeds Community Radio player, there's an interview with you, isn't there, talking about them, I think, with Peter Spafford.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
There is, from a couple of months ago. So look that up, put his name into the search engine on the website and you'll find it. So
watch this space.
Watch this space, and please do support Yorkshire Dialect, not just the Yorkshire Dialect Society, but also all the other movements towards preserving dialect and the young sort of thrust of it as well.
And just put a little commercial in, Rod Dimbleby is going to do a reprise of his Let's Talk Tyke.
Is it going to be
it's going to be in Bradford, and I think it's the first or second Saturday in January. Again, perhaps, Keith, if anybody's interested, we can pass details on.
Of course.
It'll be in the Bradford Mechanics Institute Library.
Beautiful place.
Exactly so.
There we are. And that's how I met Colin, because the first time he did these, I saw in the paper and I thought, oh, God. So, and I got in touch with him and that's where I met you. And that's how all this started. And from these little acorns...
Great oaks grow.
Or they just die in the flooded tree stump. So that's wonderful. So thank you very much to all three of you. Any last thoughts before we head off into I was going to say the sunset, but
The floods.
into the floods and the broken down trains and all the rest of it. Are we all done? Well, you've answered your riddle. You did Dad's Taxi. I'm happy. And I'm very happy that you were here, Colin. And it's a shame that Rod wasn't here. It's a shame that James couldn't get here. A shame that Armina couldn't get here. But the people who were here did some heavy lifting, and please give them a round of applause. And that is the end of the show. Thank you.
Hi, it's Ringo Starr here. Right on air, peace, love and words from...